Once there was a wolf who decided to change his nature by changing his appearance in order to kill. So the wolf put on a sheepskin in order to blend himself into the flock and follow them into the pasture. Time passed. The sheep grazed peacefully, and the shepherd was fooled by the wolf's disguise. The beast struck, at first carefully killing only a few. Then, increasingly, the wolf killed more and more. The fields filled with blood. The sheep disappeared, one by one. Suddenly, the shepherd became suspicious and awakened to the wolf's evil plan. The shepherd then captured the wolf, killed it, and hung it on a tree. Men that passed by noticed the wolf in sheep's clothing hanging there and asked the shepherd why he had done this. The shepherd answered, "The skin is that of a sheep, but its actions were those of a wolf." Saul Alinsky was a 20th century American radical. Today he's best known as the father of community organizing.
Firing line with William F. Buckley, Jr.
Mr. Saul Alinsky, who was born in Chicago in 1909, has become sort of the pet revolutionary of the church people of America. His organization is called the Industrial Areas Foundation, and for a fee, a very modest fee, Mr. Alinsky will come to your town, as he has to 40 others, to organize the poor. That may mean an end to orderly traffic, might mean sit-ins in City Hall, the cultivation of racial animosities, but Mr. Alinsky claims that's the way to get the toilets fixed in the slum buildings and to bring pride and a sense of dignity to the poor people. Something like the sense of dignity which presumably Sitting Bull and his people felt after a massacre. Mr. Alinsky doesn't mind criticism at all. In fact, what he minds is when he isn't criticized. He desires the poor to rise up and reject middle-class values.
Saul Alinsky was born in Chicago on January 30th, 1909. His Orthodox Jewish parents raised him a Jew. Saul Alinsky's relationship with his father Benjamin was complicated.
I don't think I ever hated the old man. I never really knew him, and what little I did know didn't interest me.
As distant as he was from his father Benjamin, Saul was emotionally tied to his overpowering mother, Sarah. Though Saul proclaimed to have grown up poor, this wasn't true, since his father was a successful upper-middle-class tailor. Thus, in 1926, after becoming a self-proclaimed agnostic, Saul entered the prestigious and progressivist University of Chicago. Since the social sciences were born from the philosophers of the French Revolution's revolt against religion, it's not surprising that Alinsky decided to study sociology, a science originating from the fact that life was no longer determined by the supernatural, but by natural environmental causes. Alinsky's first 2 years at university were a struggle. But in his junior year, he enrolled in a class that would change everything. The course was social pathology. The professor, E.W. Burgess. Burgess and his colleague, Robert Ezra Park, were focused on reforming America's cities. They believed the diseases of crime and poverty, of social disorganization, to have an external or ecological cause. Chicago's sociology was all about field study and the processes of social control and engineering. It had a Darwinian-based secularist evolutionary view of social change, pragmatism, and progress. Marriage and family were devalued, and self-identity was achieved by imagining how we look from another person's perspective. This collectivist mental image is called the looking glass self and is socially constructed in Marxist terms. Father Mitch Pacwa is an American Jesuit priest, public speaker, and television host of EWTN Live.
1-800-585-9396. Open line Wednesday with Father Mitch Pacwa.
See my picture, my gator?
This becomes highly problematic when you take a look at somebody like Saul Alinsky. One of the philosophers I really connected with was Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who did a book called Phenomenology of Perception. Wonderful book. And in that, he brings out that if you have as your intention an abstract goodness, then you will have an abstraction of the objects of your attention. You'll treat them as abstractions because you're seeking abstract goals. And so you see, as a classic example is Marxism.
The exercise of solidarity within each society is valid when its members recognize one another as persons.
Treat opponents not as persons, but as symbols representing interests or ideas which he believes inimical to the welfare of the people.
After graduation, Alinsky won a graduate fellowship in criminology. He pursued a fieldwork study of street gangs and organized crime, in particular, the criminal empire of the ruthless mob boss, Al Capone. Alinsky met and befriended Frank Nitti. He was the successor of the crime family after Capone went to prison. Alinsky would say, "Nitti took me under his wing. I called him the professor, and I became his student." The mob controlled the Chicago establishment. Alinsky began meeting young criminals and underworld characters and obtaining their life stories. Alinsky's biographer, Sanford Horwit, stated, "Decades later, incidents occurred that suggested Alinsky knew Chicago mobsters in high places, at least that he knew how to get to them." In 1932, Saul Alinsky married Helene Simone, a fellow student at the University of Chicago and a social worker. They would adopt 2 children. During the Depression, Saul and Helene would align themselves with new left-wing liberal or socialist groups in the Democratic Party. Although Alinsky never joined the Communist Party, his Marxism became clearly evident in his friendships and radical political rhetoric, particularly his strong support for the Stalinist effort to help defeat General Franco in the Spanish Civil War.
I knew plenty of communists in those days, and I worked with them on a number of projects. Back in the 30s, the communists did a hell of a lot of good work. Anybody who tells you he was active in progressive causes in those days and never worked with the Reds is a liar. Their platform stood for all the right things, and unlike many liberals, they were willing to put their bodies on the line. We had to start almost from scratch.
Alinsky got caught up in the successes of John L. Lewis and the CIO trade union movement. Blessed Father Jerzy Popieluszko, the martyred chaplain of Poland's Solidarity movement, and his heroic Cardinal Wyszynski discerned and witnessed to the difference between Catholic and Marxist action.
The culture of a nation is also its morality. A Christian nation must be guided by our centuries-old and proven Christian morality. A Christian nation has no need of so-called secular morality, which, in the words of the late Cardinal Wyszynski, has no face and offers no hope. It creates a permanent threat to all the spiritual values of the nation and weakens the force binding us together.
Alinsky targeted a project at the center of the meatpacking industry and the old stockyards. The neighborhood was called Back of the Yards. Its squalor was already made infamous by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, and presently surrounded by the public controversy of the attempt by CIO trade union leader John L. Lewis to unionize the meatpackers. Alinsky designed an anti-delinquency youth project, which he believed would motivate the diverse ethnic groups. First, he would befriend Herb March, who was the key local organizer for the Meatpackers Union and a member of the Young Communist League. Next, he befriended Joe Meegan, a Catholic lay leader who was director of the Davis Square Public Park, federally financed by the Roosevelt administration. March and Meegan helped him organize the Back of the Yards Neighborhood Council and located it at the youth park. Joe Meegan's priest brother was then secretary to the popular liberal activist auxiliary bishop Bernard Shiel, who had founded CYO, the National Catholic Youth Organization. Joe introduced Alinsky to the bishop, who agreed to support the project and become their honorary speaker at their council's first public gathering. They had successfully recruited a cross-section of Catholic parish leaders and CIO trade unionists. The council meeting was a great success and kicked off the project's very successful fundraising campaign. This cemented Alinsky's friendship with Bishop Shiel and opened one with John L. Lewis. Late in 1939, Bishop Shiel introduced him to the wealthy Marshall Field III, who helped Alinsky establish, in 1940, his Industrial Areas Foundation.
As far as my salary, or as far as the foundation's
Well, Marshall
operation...
Field pays that, right?
Oh, no, Marshall Field hasn't paid anything since he...
Used
since
to
he
pay
died about 15 years ago.
Oh, the old Marshall Field.
The old Marshall Field.
Marshall Fields never die.
Well, that can be your hang-up. I'm not going to get into that one. But
you have to make a living, obviously, and
well, we
should.
make our own. We're like Sherman's Army. We live off the land. That's the price of our independence.
During most of World War II, Alinsky saw an opportunity to, in his own terms, rub raw the sores of discontent, a disagreement between the University of Chicago and the Back of the Yards Council. The issue was over whether the university's settlement house or Alinsky's council should house a new infant child welfare center. Alinsky applied his Marxist conflict theory to divide, conquer, and empower his council. As he said, the struggle is the victory itself.
I mean, he may have had a utopian vision, but what he's laying out is a situation whereby it has to create the very unrest and disparities that he would say he's trying to fight against.
With the help of Bishop Shiel, Marshall Field's Chicago Sun, and the Washington Post, Alinsky beat the university into submission by painting it as the rich oppressor bully and his council as the little poor oppressed bullied. Alinsky established his image as a new left radical.
Radicals precipitate the social crisis by action. Radicals rebel. The real arena is corrupt and bloody. Life is a corrupting process from the time a child learns to play his mother off of his father in the politics of when to go to bed. He who fears corruption fears life.
In this spirit, Alinsky decided to write a book based on his back-of-the-yard experience. It would become his 1946 best-selling book, Reveille for Radicals, a work filled with the bad seeds of an amorality gathered from the blood-red Marxist fields of Europe's dying culture. One that discards civilization's most basic moral principle that the noblest of ends does not justify an immoral means.
Only through the achievement and constructive use of power can people better themselves. The fear of popular use of power is reflected in what has become the motto of liberals. We agree with your objectives, but not with your tactics.
In Reveille for Radicals, he tells of the 1946 state of the movement that he started with Back of the Yards, and develops his basic vision of community organizing, which he called then people's organizations.
Organized people can achieve limitless objectives only through the achievement and constructive use of power can people better themselves. Nothing can be lifted or moved except through power.
This work of democracy and power was to be value neutral. As Marx said, communists preach absolutely no morals.
My problem, and the problem of any organizer in a free society for an open society, is one, he doesn't have a prime truth. Truth is relative and changing.
Is this not Pope Benedict's dictatorship of relativism?
Alinsky and organizing talk the language of light. They talk the language of peace. They talk the language of helping the poor. I mean, it all sounds very nice. But what they're putting into place is something that's very dangerous and very different from what it sounds like. So I could see that being kind of a gray evil coming in, kind of like a fog coming down on a city. You don't see anything very distinctly. You see the outlines. You can kind of move through the streets, but your visibility is very limited.
The book launched a force termed the New Democracy.
The right of government derives from God as its natural and necessary principle. That authority, which first places in the people, descends from God, but in such a way as to return from below upwards. Whilst in the organization of the church, power descends from above downwards.
Jacques Maritain, the celebrated Catholic philosopher, became Alinsky's close friend during the war years. Maritain's book, Integral Humanism, published in 1936, was not truly integral. It was a humanism undertaken without Mary, who for Catholics is not an ism, but the person who is the way to and from her Son. Maritain's book and Alinsky's Reveille for Radicals were thus vulnerable to the destructive force of false humanisms and their prideful amorality.
The curse of our society today is that the so-called hierarchy value is totally distorted, and we put on top what is secondary, and we forget what is essential.
In his 1949 book, Man and State, Maritain referenced Alinsky by saying, "The program of the people should not be offered from above the people and then accepted by them. It should be the work of the people." But without affirming the primary authority of divine revelation and the Church's role in its interpretation, the people, in whom God does invest his power, are made vulnerable to surrender of moral and spiritual authority to the secular state. History has shown us when democracy goes unchecked by a proper separation of powers, it only leads to civil unrest and mob rule. All of this would contribute to the undermining of America's constitutional republic and the people's rights that come from God. In 1947, tragedy struck at the heart of the Alinsky home. While visiting a friend's cottage on Lake Michigan, his wife, Helene, drowned while attempting to save their adopted children, Catherine and David. The boy and girl survived, but his family life was devastated. Though Alinsky denied being a communist, he never denied being a socialist. He became a target of FBI and congressional investigation.
There can be no such thing as a successful traitor, for if one succeeds, he becomes a founding father.
In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy began his national investigation into the claim that communist Soviet spies, with the support of liberals, progressivists, socialists, sought to undermine the United States, its government, and culture. Norman Thomas, America's Socialist Party presidential candidate in the 1940s, said, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program, until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened." McCarthy was supported by most Catholics, led by Cardinal Spellman of New York, McIntyre of Los Angeles, and Bishop Fulton Sheen.
And whenever a civilization begins to die morally or spiritually, then there begin to appear vultures. Communism is the scavenger of decaying civilizations. It makes its way into a country and into a culture only when that culture begins to rot from the inside.
In the early 1950s, Bella Dodd, a ranking official in the American Communist Party, who had been raised a Catholic, returned to the church with the support of Bishop Fulton Sheen. She gave congressional testimony on the party's subversion of the Catholic Church. She declared, "In the 1930s, we put 1,100 men into the priesthood in order to destroy the church from within. Right now, they are in the highest places in the church." In a lecture at Fordham University, Dodd said,
"In 1944, there was a national convention of the Communist Party, which I was elected to the National Committee openly in Madison Square Garden. During that convention, there were many people who came from all over the United States. One of the social events that I attended was a dinner given by Alexander Trachtenberg, who is an old socialist, graduate of Yale, an engineer, who's head of the publishing firm for the Communists. And in the evening, Trachtenberg rose and made a little speech. He said, "When we get ready to take the United States, we will not take her under the label of communism. We will not take her under the label of socialism. These labels are unpleasant to the American people and have been smeared too much. We will take the United States under labels which we have made very lovable. We'll take it under liberalism, under progressivism, under democracy. But take it we will."
Alinsky joined the militant opposition to McCarthy. McCarthy's investigation was labeled a witch hunt. Recently available government documents, the decrypted Venona files, the published studies of Dr. Paul Kengor and M. Stanton Evans, as well as many other independent inquiries, have demonstrated that McCarthy, despite his excesses, was basically correct. In 1952, Alinsky married the rich socialite Jean Graham. He would soon occupy residences on Park Avenue and Hyde Park, and own vacation homes on Lake Ontario and in Carmel, California. Alinsky began work on a biography of Monsignor John O'Grady, director of the National Conference of Catholic Charities in Washington, whom he first met in the early 1940s. In 1955, Father Jack Egan, a young Chicago Catholic priest, was introduced to Alinsky by Jacques Maritain and Monsignor John O'Grady. They became instant friends. He would become perhaps Alinsky's ideal organizer and closest collaborator. From Cardinal Stritch, they obtained seed funding for an Industrial Areas Foundation project with the poor Puerto Rican community of Woodlawn. Father Jack Egan was developing the Woodlawn project. Ed Chambers, an ex-seminarian lay worker in Harlem's Catholic Friendship House and the Bowery's Catholic Worker, joined the Industrial Areas Foundation and its new project. Chambers would later be selected and trained by Alinsky to succeed him. In 1961, the University of Chicago, with the support of City Hall, attempted to expand its campus into the dominantly poor Afro-American area of Woodlawn. In this struggle, he pioneered and tested some of his most confrontational and threatening tactics, designed to embarrass the establishment into a calculated compromise. Alinsky's Woodlawn project used the credibility of the civil rights movement to support its revolutionary tactics on behalf of the poor. But his Marxist tactics of power, division, conflict, and deceit mirrored neither Christ nor Gandhi's nonviolent path of charity, truth, and reconciliation, basic to the fruitful spirit of the civil rights movement. Saint Pope John XXIII was then opening the Second Vatican Council in Rome and dedicating it to the Virgin Mother of God's maternal dignity. Yet, under the sheep's clothing of the so-called Spirit of Vatican II, Catholic dissidents undermined the authentic renewal of the Church by putting Our Lady in the closet. In 1964, following the race riots in Rochester, New York, Alinsky was invited there to organize the black community. Alinsky targeted the Eastman Kodak Company as the enemy and developed the organization Fight. Central to the Fight project was Father David Finks, appointed Vicar of Urban Ministry. Father Finks had become Alinsky's disciple. Describing Alinsky, he said, "He stood me on my head and showed me a radically different way to see the world, the church, domestic politics."
Even in the communities where there has been Alinskyan organizing, do we see less racism? Or do we see more polarization? Do we see less poverty? Or are there problems with poverty greater now? There's a real good argument that they're greater.
In the spring of 1966, while still married to Jean Graham, Alinsky began a relationship with Irene McInnes, an Irish Catholic woman from Boston almost 20 years younger. Soon after, he divorced his wife Jean, despite the fact that she suffered from multiple sclerosis. In 1966, Jacques Maritain celebrated the 30th anniversary of integral humanism with publication of The Peasant of Garonne. In it, he called Alinsky an authentic revolutionary and one of my very closest friends, an indomitable and dreaded organizer of people's organizations, and an anti-racist leader whose methods are as efficacious as they are unorthodox.
I entered the Society of Jesus in August 1968. 68 was a time of great turmoil.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight. A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he stood on a hotel balcony in Memphis. Within an hour, Dr. King was dead. That happened at 7 p.m. Eastern Time.
What has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, compassionate country.
There was a move within religious life. We need to remain involved in this world of ferment. So in late June of '69, after 9 months at a novitiate, the novices went to Holy Family Parish, which is one of the oldest parishes in Chicago. Of the 40,000 people who lived in the territory of the parish, 30,000 were African American, almost all living in housing projects segregated from the other 10,000, about 5,000 of whom were Hispanic, 5,000 were Italian American. Gangs from each building were there to defend the building, and this was part of the situation. I was the only novice who could speak Spanish. There were 2 Jesuits at the parish, Father Jerry Helfrich, Father John Bauman. And they'd been trained in Alinsky-style organizing. They were working with a guy named Tom Gaudet. Gaudet was a Catholic who worked with Alinsky, and he was one of his earliest disciples. So they wanted me to work with them, and I was happy to, actually, because they gave a vision of trying to help poor people gain some kind of ownership of their own fate in a situation that was way beyond their ability to control. I didn't know what I was doing by any means, but I wanted to learn from them. Father Helfrich and Father Bauman made clear, you have to choose an issue that's right up front, but an issue that's small enough that at an early stage you can win on the issue. And they saw the problem with the street gang I was working with and their need for a place as the way to deal with that. There was a big meeting of the black leaders and Hispanic leaders to unite folks in both communities. The Italians, though, were not really included. And this was part of the problem, because they were seen in some ways as the enemy. Father Helfrich said, you've got to identify an enemy. Who is the enemy here? The night of that big meeting of black and Hispanic leaders, there was also an enormous black gang fight between black gangs, which had nothing to do with me I didn't know the black gangs. But because it happened at the same time, it's associated. And a number of the leaders in the Italian community began to identify me as the instigator of these gang fights. A few days after that, 4 Italian men, came up and they stopped to ask directions. And as they're asking directions, they're taking photographs of me and some of the other kids. And then I began to get threats that, something bad's going to happen to me or to the gang. And eventually what happened was at a dance to raise money to start their own sort of youth center. That was one of the issues. We were going to get a youth center for the Hispanic kids. And standing there talking to 2 guys, Jimmy, his nickname was Babyface, who had just gotten out of the gang. And another guy, Freddie Purple, in Babyface, his girlfriend had gotten pregnant. He and his girlfriend came to me and said, we'd like to go to confession. So I got Father Helfrich and he went to confession. And about 2 weeks later, I was standing with Babyface and Freddie Purple, and 3 guys came out of the alley. Freddie Purple saw him, and he got inside a building, but we got caught. They took Babyface, made him kneel down, and they shot him to the head, and they beat me up. Just a few weeks later, they came back, and they shot Freddie Purple. And so, I had to leave town and all. I look back at that, where we had set up this situation of enemies and stirred up other enmities in the community. And that made me pull back and rethink, what are we doing here with power politics, with the issue of trying to help people? That was clear. There was no doubt of that. But this, is something that became, I think, a core problem. And the more I saw it, I also began to realize one of the problems with Alinsky's method is that it divorced itself from standard morality. It put a lot of moral issues in another compartment, the irrelevant compartment. The relevant compartment was help these poor people, whatever it takes.
Cardinal Cody of Chicago, who opposed Alinsky in organizing, shut down Monsignor John Egan's Office of Urban Affairs, thus taking away Alinsky's financial support. Father Theodore Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame University, stepped into the breach. He invited Monsignor Egan to Notre Dame, which would become his base of operations for the next 14 years. In 1968, the National Catholic Bishops' Conference president, Archbishop Dearden of Detroit, brought Bishop Joseph Bernardin to Washington as the NCCB's General Secretary. At Notre Dame, Monsignor Egan founded the Catholic Committee on Urban Ministry and joined the board of the National Catholic Reporter. Then, with the support of Archbishop Bernardin, Father David Finks was recruited from Rochester to become Associate Director of the Division of Urban Affairs of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. To respond to the national race crisis, Monsignor Egan's committee members, including Father Finks, were asked to design the Campaign for Human Development as their War on Poverty program. The plan was to begin by raising $50 million through an annual collection. 4 of the 5 members of the committee who designed the original concept which included Monsignor Egan and Father Finks, were supporters of Alinsky and thus sympathetic to his industrial area's foundation. Father Finks stated, "I was convinced that Alinsky's approach was the best there was. I didn't see anything else on the horizon." Bishop Bernardin, in his speech to the bishops, called Alinsky organizing the best process and rationale for organizing people. In 1970, the bishops approved the plan. The first national collection was taken up on November 22nd of that year. It's $8.5 million, the largest collection in church history at that time. After the campaign was established, Father Finks resigned from the active priesthood, married, and wrote the first biography of Alinsky. In 1971, Saul Alinsky married his third wife, Irene McInnes. On that same year, he published his final and most influential book, Rules for Radicals. On his dedication page, Alinsky wrote,
"Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement of the very first radical, who rebelled against the establishment, and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom. Lucifer."
When he's looking at Lucifer and calling him he's the first radical, he's not radical. He's a creation of God. And he's an angel, but a fallen angel. And his work is not successful.
In a review by The Nation, Alinsky was called the country's leading hellraiser. He opens the first chapter of his book with a statement of purpose for his community organizing that directly aligns himself with Karl Marx's diabolical conflict theory.
The life of man upon earth is warfare.
He then connects the purpose of his book with the atheistic utopianism of Fabian socialist George Bernard Shaw.
What follows is for those who want to change the world from what it is to what they believe it should be.
Finally, he connects the book's purpose with The Prince by Italian Renaissance philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli.
The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold power. Rules for Radicals was written for the have-nots on how to take it away.
Machiavelli tells us, "A wise ruler cannot and should not keep his word. When doing so is to his disadvantage. Since men are wicked and will not keep faith with you, you need not keep faith with them. But it is essential to know how to conceal how crafty one is, to know how to be a clever counterfeit and hypocrite."
The end justifies almost any means. All effective actions require the passport of morality. You do what you can and clothe it in moral garments. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Make the enemy live up to its own rules. Moral rationalization is indispensable at times of action, whether to justify the selection or the use of ends and means.
In a Playboy magazine interview, which he did a few weeks before he died in 1972, Alinsky had this to say.
"If there is an afterlife and I have anything to say about it, I will unreservedly choose to go to hell. Hell would be heaven for me. All my life I've been with the have-nots. Over here, if you're a have-not, you're short of dough. If you're a have-not in hell, you're short of virtue. Once I get into hell, I'll start organizing the have-nots over there. With a smile. They're my kind of people."
Alinsky organizing has had a vast impact on the transformation of American society, of its churches, synagogues, their morality, spirituality, marriage and family life. More than 800 local Alinskyan organizations blanket American communities today. His biographer, Sanford Horwit, said, Alinsky's own interest in the Catholic Church centered largely on its politics, both internal and in relation to other institutions and forces in American society. On June 12, 1972, after visiting his second wife, Jean, in Carmel, California, Saul Alinsky walked out of a local bank, collapsed on the sidewalk, and died of a massive heart attack. He was alone at the time of his death. Monsignor Jack Egan, perhaps his most faithful follower, and the man who asked Saul to write rules for radicals, heard the news report of his death over his car radio while driving back to the University of Notre Dame. After Alinsky's death, IAF leaders Ed Chambers, Richard Harmon, and Ernesto Cortez sat down to assess the factors that contributed to the failure of earlier organizing drives. They identified patterns of instability, ineffectiveness, and eventual disillusion due to the IAF having a charismatic leader upon whom they were too dependent. They saw that he planted the seeds, but they would take his work to unimagined levels. As IAF organizer, Michael Gakin writes in his book, Going Public, while Alinsky had many gifts and strengths, he did not create organizations that endured. So, on top of Alinsky's vision, the new team built the organization, one that would support and be supported by Marxist, socialist, progressive causes. Thus, it would extend its influence into every major institution and every facet of American culture, and finally, into the centers of economic and political power. In 1976, the U.S. Conference convened the Call to Action National Conference in Detroit as a result of the Second Vatican Council and a 2-year consultation with over 800,000 Catholics to help them shape the course of post-conciliar renewal. Unfortunately, middle management decision-makers selected its 1,340 delegates from 152 dioceses. With the support of Archbishop Bernardin, president of the Bishops' Conference, Monsignor Egan, an Industrial Areas Foundation board member, was appointed co-chair of Call to Action's plenary sessions. Ex-priests, ex-nuns, and lay dissenters were given a stage. On October 21st, Cardinal Kroll held a news conference just before the Call to Action opened. In it, he stated, "Rebels have taken over our conference." The radicals who controlled the conference manipulated it to launch a revolution of dissent. They developed an agenda that sought to create a democratic, non-hierarchical church. Thus, the conference recommended support for a competent ecumenical action group with diocesan resources used to train organizational leaders, meaning Alinskyan organizers. Their recommendations also included the ordination of women, married priests, etc. Though rejected by the bishops, the conference report galvanized continuing dissent and destruction in the church. In 1995, in a speech on the 25th anniversary of the Campaign for Human Development, Cardinal Bernardin lauded Monsignor Egan, saying, "For decades, he has been an inspiration to the campaign's work, the great work of community organizing begun in Chicago." To understand Saul Alinsky's work, we must understand the great tsunami wave of European cultural Marxism that would sweep over post-World War II America and empower him in organizing what St. Pope John Paul II termed the culture of death. Three hellfire movements of cultural Marxism would shape Saul Alinsky as they would reshape America. The first movement is Frankfurt Socialism. In 1923, Vladimir Lenin, the head of the Soviet Union, recognized that the international communist revolution would not spread to highly industrialized countries like the United States. Thus, at the University of Frankfurt in Germany, he brought together a group of scholars to retool their strategy. It was first going to be called the Marxist Institute, but in order to camouflage its nature, it was instead called the Institute for Social Research. Key members of the group moved to the United States, especially to Columbia University, during the rise of the Third Reich. While in the US, they further developed what they called critical theory. It was designed as a strategy to change, revolutionize, and bring down America by criticizing it. Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and others from the Institute developed what we now call political correctness. George Lukács, Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, and Herbert Marcuse developed the strategy of the sexual revolution, which they based on Sigmund Freud's pansexualism, the search for pleasure. Critical theory exploited the differences between the sexes to incite gender conflict. It exploited their commonalities to incite gender confusion. The second movement is Gramsci socialism. It was established by the Italian Antonio Gramsci during the years just prior to World War I and into the 1930s. It was designed to capture the mind of the society through a quiet fifth column revolution of religion in the culture. The Catholic Church was Gramsci's prime target. Gramsci's socialism was designed to destroy belief in God and to deny the reality of the supernatural life by changing the existing Christian mind into an anti-Christian mind by a false Marxist humanism which lets the entire effort be solely by man for man's sake. It was to do so by incrementally and gradually transforming America's Judeo-Christian culture by overthrowing its moral and spiritual values from within. It would target family life by infiltrating and transforming education, law, military, media and entertainment, unions, and public interest groups. Thus, it would make possible socialist revolutionary politics at a mass level. Gramsci sought to limit religion to private worship. He wanted public charity to be the lone benevolence of the Marxist totalitarian state. He wanted church and private charities to lose their tax-free status. The third movement is Fabian socialism. The Fabian Society's program of Cultural Marxism was established in the United Kingdom in the late 19th century. It took its name from the Roman general Fabius Maximus, whose victories were won by patience and attrition, by avoiding open confrontation, by slowly dumbing down and changing the moral standards of their enemies. Their symbol is the wolf in sheep's clothing, designed by Fabian member George Bernard Shaw. Their strategy was predatory, one of concealed stealth and deception. In 1887, their stated aim was the reorganization of society by the emancipation of land and industrial capital from individual and class ownership. The society accordingly works for the extinction of private ownership of property and land. In 2015, Dr. Anca Maria Cernia, a Romanian laywoman, addressed the Ordinary Synod on the Family at the Vatican. She said,
"The attack against the family and human life is part of a wider revolutionary attempt to redesign human society and human nature. Its motivation is spiritual. It is a form of revolt against God, against His moral law, and against the order of His creation. There is nothing new or progressive about it. It is the old Gnostic error in a contemporary form. Gnosticism has been known to the Church since the first Christian centuries. The basic idea is the same as the serpent's proposal to Adam and Eve, to eat the forbidden fruit, to ignore God's commandment. The serpent was saying, the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil."
Gnosticism is the evil one, the great deceiver's ultimate strategy. It's the Antichrist tyranny of relativism and will to power. The devil's names are his tactics: liar, deceiver, divider, accuser, adversary, lawless one, destroyer.
And I heard the voice from heaven saying to me, "All things that are on earth hasten to their end. For you look to the north, and behold, 5 beasts stand there. These are the 5 ferocious epochs of temporal rule, and the last is like a gray wolf, neither black nor white, but gray in their cunning, who tries to do his will with the devil's arts."
The satanic poetry of Karl Marx reveals his Gnostic plan.
I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above. I will wander godlike and victorious through the ruins of this world. Thus heaven I forfeited. I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell.
God chose our Blessed Mother to be the final conqueror of Luciferian Gnosticism.
Remember, he said, "I will put enmity between you and the woman." He said that to the serpent, the devil. Enmity, bitter hatred between you and that woman, between your offspring, those who follow you, and hers, those who follow her son, Jesus, and all his disciples. And then that climaxing statement when God said, "You will strike at her heel, but she will crush your head. And that's the promise, that the victory will be Christ's, and his mother will be his instrument to bring down Satan and his kingdom.
As Marxist socialism would emerge in the 19th century, so would begin an age in which the Blessed Mother would frequently come into our wounded world to call us back to her Son before it was too late. In 1830, Our Lady appeared to St. Catherine Labouré, offering her the miraculous medal with a warning that if men did not change,
the streets will run with blood. The whole world will be in sorrow.
In 1842, buried in a field and lost for 126 years, St. Louis de Montfort's true devotion was discovered, which prophesied the coming reign of Mary. In 1848, St. Bernadette Soubirous would be visited at Lourdes by Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, who called out,
"Penance, penance, penance."
Mary appeared at Fatima in 1917. In 1929, she said to Sister Lucia,
"The moment has come in which God asked the Holy Father, in union with all the bishops in the world, to make consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart."
In 1931, Jesus himself appeared to Sister Lucia, saying,
"They did not wish to heed my request. They will repent and do it, but it will be late. Russia will have already spread her errors throughout the world, provoking wars and persecutions of the Church. The Holy Father will have much to suffer."
In the 20th century alone, socialist governments have shaped history's greatest genocidal holocaust, killing over 100 million of their own people, igniting wars that killed 30 million more, and initiating abortion on demand that has murdered 1 to 2 billion unborn children. So where is all this death and destruction leading us?
If I exclude God from the picture, I become God. And that's exactly what's happening with so many people. I become my own God, I determine what I want, and this is the way I want to live, and no matter what I have to do to anyone else, so my end, my desire to be a God justifies any means I need to get there. And of course, that destroys the order God put there. You know, Bishop Sheen said, you know, if we continue to destroy life at every stage, the logic will be a nuclear war. That's what he said, because it would be the ultimate destruction of life.
And then the time will come when many will be ensnared, and then the children of light will be pressed in the winepress of martyrdom.
Is it too late to avoid all this? let's look at a hopeful sign from recent history. Finally, in 1984, Pope John Paul II and the bishops made the consecration of Russia asked for by Our Lady 64 years before. Since then, there has been an explosion of the number of churches in Russia, from several hundred to over 30,000. From 22 to over 800 monasteries. From 0 to over 100 theological schools. Today, Russia is rapidly restoring its civil laws to mirror God's moral ones. It remains one of the few countries in the developed world where the Christian faith is growing in importance for the people.
When Russia receives the gift of faith, Russia will have a new role. And its role then will be to be an apostle to the rest of the world. Why are we so hopeful about Russia? For one reason. Russia has fire.
There are three social principles of the Catholic Church, all rooted in the supernatural life. First, we must reclaim in our culture the sacred dignity of the human person, made in the image and likeness of God.
Thus, the root of modern totalitarianism is to be found in the denial of the transcendent dignity of the human person, who is the visible image of the invisible God, is therefore by his very nature the subject of rights which no one may violate.
Second, we must reclaim the principle of solidarity, a concern for the family and common good of all God's children as members of the body of Christ.
The foundation of this society rests, first of all, in the indissoluble union of man and wife, according to the necessity of natural law, and is completed in the mutual rights and duties of parents and children. Saint Gregory the Great tells us, "He that has a talent, let him hide it not. He that has abundance, let him quicken himself to mercy and generosity. And he that has art and skill, let him do his best to share its use and utility with his neighbor."
Finally, we must reclaim the principle of subsidiarity, the primacy of grassroots decision-making, not by an impersonal federal government, but in our towns, communities, and families.
What is important today is to claim with great courage the rights due to us as a nation. The right to God, to love, to freedom of conscience, to our culture, and to our national heritage. A nation cannot advance into the future if it cuts itself off from its past. It should be remembered that the road upon which we have walked as a nation is a Christian road. The tree without roots will soon be toppled over.
Don't hate Saul Alinsky. Pray for him. His passion and commitment for helping poor people reclaim their dignity was a good intention. But his tragedy and our inherited tragedy is the evil means he and his followers used to achieve this.
Well, no one could read the life of St. Francis without reading about the story of the Wolf of Gubbio, which is a very enchanting story. Some say it was a fable, but it appears that recent facts have shown that it was indeed a historical event in the life of St. Francis.
A long time ago, in the Umbrian city of Gubbio, a large wolf appeared, so terrible and so fierce that he not only devoured animals, but also preyed on men. All the people of Gubbio were in great fear of the beast, so they dared not go beyond the city walls. At that time, St. Francis was living in Gubbio, caring for the poor. Feeling great compassion for the people of the city, he decided to face the wolf alone. Once in its lair, the wolf ran toward St. Francis, snarling, jaws open wide, ready to strike. At that very moment, St. Francis made the sign of the cross. The wolf stopped running and laid down at his feet, meek as a lamb. St. Francis spoke to the wolf from his heart, imploring him to stop killing men made in God's image, and promised that if he did so, the townspeople would care and feed him for the rest of his life. The wolf agreed by lifting his paw and placing it softly in the hand of St. Francis. The wolf followed St. Francis back into town, and the wolf, sorrowful for his actions, was forgiven. It became a gentle friend to the people, living in peace with them, fed by them, to the end of his days.
I believe the story holds great truth. We all have a wolf in our lives, whether it's imaginary or real, that this wolf has to be encountered. But we encounter that wolf, that fear-filled entity or object or person or place or thing, we encounter that with faith. And when we recognize that God, who tells us over and over and over again in His Word, be not afraid.
The foundation of America and our philosophy, you know, embodied in our Constitution and so on, the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all stems from the acknowledgement of a creator and one who, by his divine providence, you know, is active in our world.
What did Christ do? I mean, he was looking at how to bring people together. In Christ, there's neither slave nor free. We're one people, and we serve one another.
Dignity as persons who can accept other persons and give ourselves to other persons is an image of what goes on in the Blessed Trinity.
We are made for truth. The main thing is to understand, ultimately, truth is not a proposition. Truth is a person. Keep this in mind when you say truth. You're referring to God very much as when you say life or you say beauty, you're referring to God.
And this is the message that St. Francis has to give to us, that God is present to us in a most humble and a hidden way. Mother Teresa told her sisters to have their holy hour, their Eucharistic holy hour every day, so to train the eyes of their soul to see Christ present in the consecrated host, so that they might more easily see the presence of Christ in the homeless, and the addicted and the abandoned that would be at their door.
We must return again to our Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Son of Mary, who never stops searching for us in the empty fields of this life. He waits for us there. He is always waiting.
To purchase the EWTN Religious Catalog Home Video DVD, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, log on to our web store, EWTNRC.com, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or call 1-800-854-6316.
What do you say when someone challenges your pro-life beliefs? Do you know the right answers? Next time, Olivia Gans Turner testifies to the humanity of the unborn child and dispels the lies that dehumanize the baby.
We as pro-life people always have to use the word mother, because what's happening in that moment is that this mother is making a life and death decision for her child.
When they say, you say, here on EWTN.
From EWTN News Nightly in Washington.